For 7 years, the master of Caldmoor House had not once stepped beyond a single room. He took his meals at that door, he passed his letters under it. The servants spoke of him in whispers, and the village spoke of him not at all, for there was nothing new to say. A frail old gentleman, they told each other, ruined in his nerves, who wished only to be left in the cold and the quiet. The years went by, and the fog came in off the marsh each autumn and lay against the windows of that house, and the man behind the one closed door grew into a kind of legend, the sort of legend a place keeps without quite believing, the way a child half believes in the thing that lives at the bottom of the stair. Also, if you like, you can enjoy all these stories on Spotify. Link will be in the description. Then, on a night thick with marsh fog, a man was beaten to death on the causeway below that house. He was a careful man, a man of the law, and he had come a long way to ask a single question. He never asked it twice. They found him in the grey of the morning, with his skull broken and his pockets emptied, and the marsh water creeping up to the soles of his boots, and his watch lying open in the mud beside him, with the glass cracked across and the hands stopped at 20 minutes to midnight. 3 people swore, on their lives, that they had seen the master of Caldmoor walking the marsh that night. In his green dressing gown, his face pale at the edge of the lantern light. They were honest people, and frightened, and none of them had spoken to the others before they spoke to the police, and all 3 told the same tale. But the master of Caldmoor House had not left that room in 7 years. So who was on the causeway? And if the answer is the man in the room, then how did a man who had not walked in 7 years come to be walking the marsh at midnight with murder in his hands? And if the answer is not the man in the room, then where was he, who was he, and why would no living soul in that whole grey valley confirm the simple fact of where their master had been? This is the case Sherlock Holmes would later call the strangest he ever solved without once needing to leave his chair. He meant it as a small joke, in the way he had, but there was a truth under the joke, for the answer to the whole matter was sitting still in one cold room the entire time, waiting for someone to go up the stairs and look at it properly. This is the case of the man who never left the room. To understand how a dead man came to be seen walking, we have to begin where Holmes began. On a wet October evening, with a frightened young woman climbing the 17 steps to his door, and the rain coming down on Baker Street, and the lamps below wearing their halos of wet gold. The rain had set in early that October, and by 6 o'clock the gas lamps wore halos of wet light, and the cabs went by below with their wheels hissing on the cobbles. I had drawn my chair to the fire and was content to watch the coals, while Holmes, restless as a caged thing, paced from window to hearth and back, complaining that London had grown dull and that the criminal classes had lost all imagination. He had read every newspaper twice and thrown them all down in disgust, and he was, I knew, within an hour of reaching for the little Morocco case in the drawer, which I had learned not to mention and could not prevent. "There is a cab stopping at our door," said he, of a sudden, without turning from the window. "A four-wheeler, not a hansom, which a single passenger takes only for the privacy of it. A lady. She is travelling alone, which she dislikes, for she keeps to the lit side of the pavement even now, with the cab between her and the dark. And she has come a long way to be afraid, Watson, for observe how she stands a moment in the rain before she rings, as though the door itself might refuse her. There, she has gathered her courage. We shall have her on the stair in a moment, and I think we shall be glad of her, for whatever has driven a young woman across half of England in this weather will not be dull." A moment later there was the ring, and Mrs. Hudson's tread, then a lighter step upon the stair, and our landlady showed in a young woman of perhaps 24. She was pale and well-dressed in a manner 2 or 3 seasons out of fashion, which spoke of a good family fallen quiet rather than poor, and she carried herself with the particular stillness of a person who has rehearsed what she means to say 100 times and is mortally afraid it will sound mad the moment she says it aloud. "Mr. Holmes," she said, and her voice was steady, though it cost her something to keep it so. "My name is Eleanor Merivale. I have come because a man is dead, and because I think I am the only person alive who knows the dead man was telling the truth." Holmes's eyes, which a moment before had been heavy and half closed with boredom, came suddenly and entirely awake. He He drew out the basket chair for her with his own hands, a courtesy I rarely saw him trouble with, and he did not take his own seat until she had taken hers. "Pray sit," said he, "and warm yourself, and tell it from the very beginning. Leave nothing out because it seems small. In my experience, the small things are the ones that have teeth, and it is nearly always the detail a client thinks unworthy of mention that turns out to be the hinge the whole door swings upon. Watson, a glass of wine for Miss Merivale. She has come further than she has slept." "You are right that I have not slept," she said, with the ghost of a smile. "How could you know it?" "The same way I know you came up from the country this morning on the slow line that comes in at the eastern stations, that you have lost weight recently and quickly, and that you have spent a part of today in a solicitor's office where you were kept waiting a long while. The mud on the hem of your travelling dress is the particular grey clay of the Essex marshes, not yet brushed because you came straight on from the train without going to a hotel. Your glove is loose at the wrist where it fitted close not long ago, and there is a smudge of red sealing wax upon the inside of your right forefinger, the kind that comes of breaking a seal and worrying at the wax while you wait, as one does in an antechamber when one has been told the gentleman will see you presently, and presently has become an hour. None of which matters in the least, except to show you that I am attending. Now, begin." She drew a breath and told it haltingly at first, then faster, in the way people do when they have carried a thing too long and entirely alone. "My uncle is Aldous Merivale, of Caldmoor House, near the village of Saxby-le-Marsh. My father, Edward, was his younger brother. There were 3 of them, you understand. Aldous the eldest, then my father, then Stephen, the youngest, who was always the odd one, the one nobody quite knew what to do with. My father married, and I was born. Both my parents died of the diphtheria within a single fortnight, when I was 11 years old, and I was sent to Caldmoor to be a kind of ward of my uncle's. Aldous was named my guardian in the legal way of it, but I have not been permitted to see him, Mr. Holmes, since I was 17. That is 7 years now." "Not permitted," repeated Holmes. "It is a strong word for a guardian and his ward. By whom were you not permitted?" "By my other uncle, by Stephen. He lives at Caldmoor still, and manages everything, because Aldous, you see, is an invalid. He suffered a collapse 7 years ago. A collapse of the nerves, they called it, and from that day to this he has not left his room." "Not the house," said Holmes very quietly. "The room." "The room, Mr. Holmes, one single room, at the top of the east stair. He takes his meals there. He writes his letters there. He sees no one, and goes nowhere, and Stephen carries his wishes down to the household and out to the lawyers, and that is all. I was sent away to a school in Tunbridge Wells the very year it began, and when I came back in the holidays, the door was already closed, and it has stayed closed. I have stood outside it. I have spoken to it. I have begged, through the wood, to be let in to see the only family I had left, and the only answer I ever had was Stephen's hand on my shoulder, drawing me gently away, and Stephen's voice saying that the master could not be disturbed, that I must understand, that I was a good girl and must be patient. Her hands had begun to twist in her lap, and I have not heard my Uncle Aldous' voice, Mr. Holmes, in 7 years, not one word in his own voice. Everything comes through Stephen." There was a silence. The fire shifted, and the rain went on against the glass, and I confess that even then, before any of the rest of it, something in that simple statement laid a cold finger on the back of my neck. A door closed for 7 years, a voice no one had heard. "You loved your Uncle Aldous," said Holmes. It was not a question. "He was kind to me," she said simply. "He was a stern man, and a proud one, and the village was afraid of him, but he was kind to me. He used to give me books, and write my name in the front of each one in his great looping hand, always with a flourish under it, like a man signing a treaty. He wore a signet ring, an old square garnet, on the little finger of his right hand, and when he wrote, he would turn it inward so it would not catch the page, and I used to watch the red stone wink as the pen moved. I was 11 and newly orphaned, and he was the one person in that cold house who seemed glad I was there." She looked up. "That is why I cannot bear it that they have shut me out of his last years, and it is why, When Mr. Vane began to have his doubts, I listened to him, when perhaps a wiser girl would have let it alone. "Tell me about Mr. Vane," said Holmes, and I saw him file away, behind those grey eyes, the matter of the great looping hand and the right hand and the garnet ring, the way a man slips a coin into his waistcoat to spend later. His name was Harrington Vane. He was a solicitor and one of the 3 trustees of my uncle's estate. He is the dead man, Mr. Holmes. He was found 4 mornings ago on the Marsh causeway below Caldmoor, his skull broken, his watch and his pocketbook gone. The coroner has called it a robbery by some passing tramp, and the inquest was a formality, and the village is content to think it so, because the alternative is a thing the village would rather not think. But I do not believe it, and I will tell you why. My grandfather, old Joseph Merivale, made a strange will, and it has hung over the whole family like weather ever since. He did not love his sons equally, Mr. Holmes, and he did not trust the youngest at all. So he placed the entire fortune in a trust. The income, all of it, every penny, goes to Aldous, the eldest, for as long as Aldous shall live. On the day Aldous dies, the whole of the capital passes to me, as the last of the next generation, the only child of the 3 brothers. And Stephen, the youngest, receives nothing. Nothing but the right to live in the house and a small allowance for the keeping of it, an allowance that ends the moment Aldous's life ends. Holmes's eyes had narrowed by a fraction, and he had brought his fingertips together before his lips, which was always the sign that the machine within him had begun to turn. "Let me be sure I have the shape of it," said he. "While your Uncle Aldous draws breath, your Uncle Stephen has a roof, an income, and a place in the world. And on the day your Uncle Aldous stops drawing breath, your Uncle Stephen has none of those things. No roof, no income, no place, and is turned out into a world he has not lived in for 30 years, while you, the niece, come into everything. So your grandfather built a will that ties one man's fortune and another man's ruin to the single thread of a third man's heartbeat." "Yes," she said, "that is it exactly." "It is a wicked sort of cleverness," murmured Holmes, "the kind of cleverness that thinks itself justice and is only cruelty with a lawyer's seal upon it. Your grandfather meant to bind Stephen, to keeping Aldous alive, I suppose, since Stephen's bread depended on it. He cannot have foreseen the shapes such a binding might take." "Go on, you have not yet told me where Mr. Vane fits, nor why a careful solicitor came to die in a marsh." "For 7 years," she said, "the trustees were content with paper. Each quarter a letter came from Caldmoor, written in my Uncle Aldous's own hand, confirming that he lived and was of sound mind, witnessed by Stephen and by Mrs. Price, the housekeeper. The trustees read the letters and matched the signature against the old ones in their files, and were satisfied, and the income went on being paid into the household, and no one went to Caldmoor, because no one was asked to, and the marsh is a long way from London, and the trains are bad. But last spring old Mr. Tolliver died, who had been the senior trustee for 30 years, and in his place the firm appointed Mr. Harrington Vane. And Mr. Vane was a different kind of man. He was new and careful, and he had not grown comfortable over 30 years of letters. He said a thing the others had never quite let themselves say. He said that a signature upon paper is not a living man, and that he would not put his name to the next quarterly confirmation, would not certify that Aldous Merivale lived, until he had seen Aldous Merivale with his own 2 eyes, breathing, in a chair, in that room. And he wrote to Stephen and asked for an interview. He wrote 3 times. 3 times Stephen refused him, pleading my uncle's nerves, the dreadful effect a stranger would have, the week of terrors that any disturbance brought on. And Mr. Vane grew suspicious, as I think any honest man would, for a thing a family fights so hard to keep you from seeing is generally a thing worth seeing. He learned somehow that I too had my doubts, and he wrote to me, privately, and we became, in a way, allies. He told me, in his last letter, which I have here and will leave with you, that he meant to go to Caldmoor in person, whether Stephen liked it or no, and that if he were turned from the door, he would go directly to the police, and to a doctor, and to the courts, and have the room opened by law. She drew the letter from her bag with a hand that was not quite steady, and laid it on the table between us. "He went to Caldmoor 4 days ago," she said. "In the afternoon, Stephen has admitted, since, that Mr. Vane called, and that rather than face the police and the courts, he gave way at the last, and permitted Mr. Vane a short audience with my Uncle Aldous in the room. And Stephen says Mr. Vane came away satisfied, his doubts laid to rest, and went off toward the village in good spirits to catch the evening train. That same night, Mr. Vane was beaten to death on the causeway, and the very next morning, by the first post, a letter reached the trustee's office in London. A quarterly confirmation dated the day Mr. Vane died in my Uncle Aldous's hand, saying that the interview had passed off well, that Mr. Vane had been most courteous, and that all was in order. Holmes sat very still for a long moment. Then he reached out and turned up the lamp and read Vane's last letter through twice without a word and laid it down. "A trustee comes 100 miles, he said softly, almost to himself, to satisfy himself upon a single point, that a certain man is alive. He is at last admitted and granted his proof and goes away satisfied. And that same night he is murdered. And the next morning the very man he came to certify writes cheerfully to say how well the meeting went. Miss Merivale, your instinct is a sound one, sounder than you perhaps know. There is something in that house that does not wish to be looked at, and a man went to look at it, and the looking cost him his life." "There is more," she said, and now her voice dropped, and she glanced at the dark window as though something might be at it. "The night Mr. Vane died, 3 people saw my Uncle Aldous on the marsh, the dairyman, Cole, taking his cans down before dawn, the publican's wife, who had stepped out to the well, and a boy bringing eels up to the inn. All 3, separately, at different points along the causeway, saw a tall figure in a green dressing gown, walking near the place where Mr. Vane was found, and all 3 of them knew my Uncle Aldous by sight from the years before he shut himself away, and all 3 swear, and will not be moved, that it was he. But my uncle has not left his room in 7 years. Stephen swears it, Mrs. Price swears it, and the housemaid who carried up his supper that very evening swears she heard him moving about behind the closed door at the very hour Mr. Vane was being killed half a mile off on the marsh." The rain filled the silence. Holmes had closed his eyes. "So you see my difficulty, Mr. Holmes," said Eleanor Merivale, and there were tears standing in her eyes at last, not falling, only standing. "Either my uncle walked out upon the marsh and broke a man's head, which cannot be, for he is a frail invalid who has not crossed his own threshold in 7 years, or my uncle never left his room and was where they all swear he was, and 3 honest people who have no reason to lie saw a phantom in his shape upon the causeway. I have turned it over and over until I am ill with it, and I do not know which of those 2 things frightens me more." Holmes opened his eyes. "There is a third possibility," he said, "which frightens me a very great deal more than either of yours, and which I shall not name to you tonight, because I have learned the cost of naming a thing before I have stood in the place and felt the truth of it under my own hand. I will say only this: you have done right to come to me, and you have done right to be afraid, and you must now do exactly as I tell you, which is to go to your hotel and sleep, and not return to Caldmoor before I do. Watson, the Bradshaw. There is a train into the Essex marshes in the morning, and for the first time in a tedious month, I find that I am no longer in the least bored." He saw her down the stair himself, and put her into a cab, and stood a moment in the rain at the open door, watching the red lamp of it dwindle down toward the river. When he came back up, he stood by the fire a long while without speaking, and I knew better than to break in upon it. "What is the third possibility, Holmes?" I said at last. "You would not thank me for it tonight, Watson," he said. "Sleep. It is a long way to the marsh, and a colder country than London, in more than one sense, and I think, before we are done, we shall both wish for this fire." We took the early train into a country that seemed to lose its colour as we went, mile by mile, until it had given up colour altogether. The good green fields of the home counties gave way to flat black fen, and the fen to open marsh, a country of standing water, and pale reed, and a sky that came down to meet it without any clear line between, so that a man might stare and never quite find the place where the land left off and the heaven began. There were no hills, There was nothing to break the wind, which came in off the unseen sea and went through a greatcoat as though it were paper. Here and there a black windmill stood derelict against the white, and once a heron lifted out of a dike and flapped away low and grey, and otherwise we might have been the last two men alive. At the little halt of Saxby-le-Marsh, we stepped down onto an empty wooden platform, and the train pulled away behind us, and the sound of it died, and there came after it a silence so complete that it had a weight to it, a pressure on the ears, broken only by the wind in the reeds, and very far off, the lonely complaint of some marsh bird. A single dog-cart waited in the lane, and a single fog stood against the end of the road like a wall built across the world. "You are very quiet, Holmes," I said, as the cart jolted us along a causeway raised a few feet above the level of the marsh, with the black water on either hand. "I am listening," said he. "A place will tell you a great deal about itself before any person in it troubles to open his mouth, if only you have the patience to attend. And this place, Watson, is telling me that it keeps secrets, and that it has kept them a long time, and that it has grown very, very tired of the keeping. There is a particular flavour to a country that holds its breath. You will taste it before the day is out." The driver was a marshman of few words, but Holmes, who could draw talk from a stone when he chose, had a little out of him before we reached the house. The Merivales were an old family, and a strange one, much come down. The eldest, the master, had not been seen these 7 years. Poor gentleman, ruined in his wits. The youngest, Mr. Stephen, was much respected for his patience in nursing his brother all alone. As for the lawyer that was killed, well, that was a bad business. But the marsh took men, it always had, and a stranger walking the causeway after dark with money in his pocket was a stranger asking for the marsh to take him. And was there talk of old Hawkins? Holmes asked idly. The driver spat over the side and would say only that Hawkins was a sot and a thief, and that the police knew their business, and after that he would say no more at all. Then Caldmoor House came up out of the mist before us, and the driver fell silent of his own accord, and so, I noticed, did Holmes. It rose out of the marsh like something dredged up from the bottom of a slow river. It was a tall, plain, square building of grey stone gone black with damp, 3 stories and a high slate roof, the whole of it shuttered or curtained but for 2 or 3 windows that showed dark glass, and behind it nothing. The garden before it had gone entirely to seed, the gravel green with moss, the hedges grown wild and unclipped into shapeless walls. Of all the chimneys upon that great cold pile, one only smoked, a thin grey thread of it rising and bending off in the wind, and all the rest stood cold and dead against the white sky. And over the whole place there lay a stillness that was not in the least like peace. It was the stillness of a held breath, the stillness of a room where something is being concealed. The front door opened before we had so much as set foot upon the step, as though we had been watched the length of the lane, and a man stood in the gap of it. He was perhaps 60, a good deal slighter than the elder brother in the photograph Eleanor had shown us, with a soft, sorrowful, kindly face, thinning grey hair brushed across a high forehead, and the careful, lowered, deliberate manner of a man who has spent a great many years moving softly and speaking quietly in a house given over to illness. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." He inclined his head to each of us, and his voice was gentle and warm and tired. "My niece telegraphed that you would be coming. I confess, gentlemen, that I am glad of it, gladder than perhaps you expected. This dreadful business of poor Vane has set the whole village whispering, and the whispers have found their way to my brother's name, of all names, and a sick old man who has harmed no one in 7 years is being made the subject of ghost stories by people who should know better. If you can lay these tales to rest, and let my brother die in such peace as is left to him, you will have done this unhappy family a kindness I shall not forget. But come in out of the wet. You are perished, I can see. Come and have something hot." I will own that, on that doorstep, my whole heart went out to the man, and that I caught myself thinking, here at least is one true thing in a false business. Here is plain brotherly love. It was only afterward, a long while afterward, that I understood I had been shown, with great care and great skill, exactly and only the thing I was meant to see. We stepped past him into the hall of Caldmoor House, and the first thing I knew of that house, the very first, before the dark oak panelling, before the dim ancestral portraits ranged along the stair, before the smell of damp stone and old smoke, and something else beneath it that I could not name, was the cold. It was not the ordinary cold of an old and ill-heated house upon a wet October day. I have lived in such houses and know that cold well. This was another thing entirely. It was a deep, settled, established, deliberate cold. The cold of a place in which the fires are kept unlit on purpose, year upon year, until the very stones have forgotten what warmth is. My breath smoked in the hall. The great fireplace by the foot of the stair was swept and black and empty, and the emptiness of it had a look of permanence, as though no flame had stood in that grate within the memory of the house. I drew my coat the closer about me, and Holmes, I saw, did not. Holmes had stopped just within the door and gone entirely still, the deep, alert, pointing stillness of a hound that has caught a scent across a field, and he was looking at that empty grate with an expression I could not read, as though the cold, dead fireplace had spoken to him in a language he was only beginning to make out. Stephen led us through to the one living room in that dead house, a small parlour off the hall, where a thin and grudging fire burned in a small grate, the only fire, I think, in all that great building, fed by the smoke of the one living chimney. There a grey, stooped, anxious woman, whom Stephen named to us as Mrs. Price, the housekeeper, brought us tea, which was at least hot, though her hands shook so upon the tray that the cups rattled in their saucers, and she set them down with a small clatter and drew back at once toward the door. She would not meet my eye, nor Holmes's. She had about her the look of a woman who has been afraid for so long of something she dares not name that fear has stopped being a feeling and become simply her weather, the air she breathes, the medium she moves through. Holmes, over the tea, made himself charming, which he could do better than any man living when there was something to be got by it. He spoke of the wildness and the beauty of the marsh, of the great difficulty and expense of keeping up such a house in such a place, of the heavy burden that must fall upon Stephen's shoulders, carrying it all alone. And little by little, in the patient way a man draws water hand over hand from a very deep well, he drew up out of Stephen Merivale the whole shape and pattern of the strange life that was lived at Caldmoor. The master, Aldous, lived at the top of the east stair, in the one room, and had done these 7 years. Stephen alone attended him. Stephen alone carried up his meals 3 times a day and carried down the trays. Stephen alone cleaned the room, lit and tended it, sat with him, read to him in his bad nights. No servant entered it, not Mrs. Price, not the housemaid, no one. The master, Stephen explained, since his collapse could not endure the presence of strangers, could not endure to be looked upon, could not endure scarcely anything but the dark and the cold and the quiet, and the one familiar face of his brother. It had been hard, Stephen said, very hard, in the early years. He had grown used to it. A man can grow used to almost anything. It must be a great labour, said Holmes gently, setting down his cup, to nurse him so, with your own hands, all alone, all these years, and no relief, and no companionship but his, and he so far sunk. Few brothers would do as much. Most would have had him to an institution long ago, and slept the easier for it. He is my brother, said Stephen simply, and spread his thin hands and looked at the fire. What else would I do? We have only each other now. When he goes, I shall have no one. And there was in his voice such a depth of quiet, exhausted sorrow that I could have wept for him, and was ashamed of the cold third possibility that Holmes had not named, and that I had begun, against my will, to half perceive. One small thing puzzles me, said Holmes, in the same light and friendly tone, as a matter merely of a sick man's comfort, and you will forgive a doctor's friend his professional curiosity. The house is bitterly cold, Mr. Merivale. I have seldom been colder indoors, and your brother is an old man and an invalid, and the one thing an old and failing body most requires is warmth. Yet I see no fire laid for him, nor any sign that one ever is. Surely of all the rooms in the house, his should be the warmest. A shadow crossed Stephen Merivale's soft face. It was there, and it was gone, so quickly that a man not watching for it would never have seen it at all. But Holmes was watching for it, and so, by then, was I. "It is part of his affliction," said Stephen, after the smallest pause. "One of the cruelest parts of it. Since his collapse, he cannot abide heat in any form. Warmth brings on the terrors, the worst of them. He must have the window standing open and the room kept cold as the season can make it, or he cannot rest at all, and falls into such fits of horror as you would not wish to see. The doctors who saw him at the very first, before he refused to be seen by any of them, called it a derangement of the nerves, a thing of the brain, and said it could not be reasoned with, only managed. So I have learned not to argue with it. I keep his room exactly as he needs it kept, cold and dark and open to the air, however it grieves me, because the one time I tried to light him a fire, out of pity, in his second winter, he wept and tore at himself until I put it out. I have not tried again." At that moment there came a heavy, dull, repeated thud from the yard beyond the parlour window, the sound of weighty things being unloaded onto stone, and through the streaming glass I saw a cart drawn up in the side court, and a man in a leather apron lifting down from it great blocks of some grey substance wrapped about in sacking and straw, and carrying them in at a low door, and the water running off them dark across the cobbles as he went. It was ice, a cart of ice, in October, on the edge of the marsh, drawn up to that cold house where one fire only burned. "Ah," said Holmes, following my eye to the cart in the yard, as though it were the merest idle thing. "You take in ice, I observe, even at this season. I should not have thought it kept in such weather." It was Mrs. Price who answered, from her place by the door, and she answered too quickly, the words tumbling out a half-second before Stephen could shape his own. "For the dairy, sir," she said. "We keep a dairy still, what's left of one. And for the master's room, when the weather turns close and heavy, as it does off the marsh, for he cannot bear it close at all, and the ice keeps the room as he needs it through the warm spells." And having said it, she pressed her lips together and looked as though she would have given a year of her life to have the words back. Holmes's eyes went, without haste and without any change in his pleasant expression, from the ice cart in the yard, to Mrs. Price's frightened face by the door, to Stephen's careful, sorrowful one, and last of all to the empty, swept, eternal blackness of the parlour grate. And he said nothing at all. He thanked Mrs. Price for the tea, and remarked again upon the wildness of the country, and let the matter go by as though it had never been. But I, who had sat across fires from him for years, saw the change that came over him then, the deep inward settling, the closing of some inner door upon a thing he had seen and would not yet speak of, and I knew that somewhere far down a long dark passage of his mind a shape had begun to come clear, and that he liked the look of that shape not at all. Holmes asked, as of course he must, to be taken up to see the master, and Stephen refused him, as of course he did, with a great and sincere show of regret. "He sees no one," said Stephen. "I am sorry, truly. Mr. Vane's visit, only 4 days since, cost my brother a week of terrors, from which he has not yet begun to recover. To bring another stranger to his door now, hard upon it, might undo what little peace is left to him entirely. I cannot do it. I will not. He is my brother, and what is left of him is in my keeping, and I will not break him for any man's curiosity, though he were from Scotland Yard itself." "I would not for the world distress him," said Holmes, untroubled, mild as milk. "Let us not speak of my going up then, but might your brother be willing, perhaps, to write me a single line? A detective, Mr. Merivale, is a kind of physician, you may tell him, a physician of events, and asks only after symptoms. He need not see me, nor I him. I should be content with a few words in his own hand upon a single point. On the night Mr. Vane died, did he, from that open window of his that looks out across the very causeway, hear or see anything at all out of the common? A light, a cry, a figure on the path? The window that must, you tell me, always stand open. He may have seen more than he knows." Stephen hesitated, and I watched the hesitation, and could not read it. Then he bowed his head. "I will ask him," he said. "I can promise nothing. Wait here." And he took a candle from the hall table, lighting it at the parlour fire, and he took it up in his left hand, and went out, and up the dark stair alone, and we heard his tread climbing, and a long pause, and the small sound of a latch lifted far above, and a longer silence, and at last the latch again, and the tread descending. We waited a good while. When he came down at last, he carried a folded paper, which he held out to Holmes with the grave and careful air of a man delivering something that is both precious and dangerous. "He is greatly distressed," said Stephen. He wept. "I must beg you, gentlemen, to make this the very end of it, and to trouble him no further, whatever you may think of my brother or of me." And he stood by while Holmes unfolded the paper and read it. It was written in a thin, spidery, sloping hand, and it said, "I heard nothing. I saw nothing upon that night. I am very ill, and I beg only to be let alone, and to be allowed to die in the quiet of my own room, without men coming to torment me. Aldous Merivale." Holmes read it through twice, slowly, and turned it once to the grey light of the window, holding it close, before he folded it away into his pocket-book with a small grave bow of thanks. "You have been more than patient with us," he said, "and we shall trouble your brother no further today, as you ask. We will find lodging in the village, and call again tomorrow, if we may, upon yourself alone, with a few small questions about the estate that need not touch upon him at all." And Stephen, plainly relieved, saw us out into the cold and the fog, and the great door of Caldmoor closed behind us with a sound like a stone laid over a well. The instant we were beyond the dead hedge, and out of all sight of the windows, Holmes had the paper out again, and was studying it as we walked, holding it almost against his nose, tilting it to catch what little light there was. "Watson," he said, "cast your mind back to last evening. Our client told us, did she not, in so many words, that her uncle Aldous was a right-handed man, that he signed the fly-leaf of every book he gave her with his right hand, a great looping flourish with a line drawn under it, that he wore a garnet signet ring upon the little finger of his right hand, and turned it inward as he wrote. She was most particular and most fond about it. You recall it?" "Distinctly," said I. "Then attend to this hand. Look here and here. Every letter of it leans hard to the left, the way a hedge leans before a steady wind from one quarter. The weight and the pressure of every stroke falls upon its left side, where a right-handed man's weight falls upon the right. And see here, this small dragged smear across the wet of the ink just below the signature. That is the mark of a writer's own cuff, trailing back across what he has only that moment written, and a man's cuff trails so across his own line only when he writes from the right side toward the left, leading with the left hand. This letter, Watson, was not written by a right-handed man pretending to nothing. It was written fluently, naturally, habitually, by a man who has written with his left hand all his life." "A man may break his right arm," I offered, "or lose the use of it. 7 years bedridden, with a palsy perhaps, on the right side. He may, and it is conveniently the case that the right hand failed, the wits collapsed, the door closed, and the new left-handed correspondence all began in one and the same fortnight 7 years ago. Perhaps. I do not like a coincidence that does so very much work for the man who benefits by it." He folded the letter away. "And I will tell you a smaller thing, Watson, that I observed while our host carried his candle up the stair. He took it up in his left hand. He stirred his tea, an hour earlier, with his left. He buttered his bread with his left. Mr. Stephen Merivale is a left-handed man, as plain a left-hander as I have ever watched at a tea-table. It proves nothing whatever, on its own. It is merely the second thread. But it runs, Watson, you will notice, to precisely the same dark place as the first." We took 2 cramped rooms at the Saxby Inn, the Heron, a low place of black beams and red firelight, and the everlasting smell of marsh mud and stale beer. And there we found Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, already comfortably installed, his boots to the fire, and very well pleased with himself, for the trustees of the estate had called the yard in over Vane's death, and Lestrade had come down, and Lestrade believed he had already laid his hand upon his man. "Open and shut, Mr. Holmes," said he, with the air of indulgent superiority he reserved for the rare cases where he thought himself ahead. I don't doubt it amuses you to come all this way for a thing that's plain as a pikestaff, but there it is, a discharged servant. Hawkins, the name is. Old Ezra Hawkins. Turned out of Caldmoor some 6 years back. No character given him, and there's bad blood there, you may be sure. A man does not get turned off without a character for nothing. He's been seen skulking about the marsh ever since, full of grievance and full of gin, and he was seen upon the Causeway Road the very night the lawyer was killed. Robbery, Mr. Holmes, plain robbery by a desperate man who knew the gentleman would be carrying his return fare and his watch. The watch is gone, isn't it? The pocketbook is gone. What more do you want? Very little more, said Holmes pleasantly, warming his hands. Only one small thing, Lestrade, which I am sure you will explain to me, for it has been troubling my simple mind all the way from London. Tell me why a drunken servant who breaks a gentleman's head for the sake of a watch and a few sovereigns should also take the trouble, the very same night, to forge that dead gentleman's professional satisfaction in his employer's own hand, and to carry the forgery to the village, and to post it up to a firm of London solicitors by the first train in the morning, so that it should arrive before the body was scarcely cold. Robbers, in my experience, take the watch. They do not, as a rule, attend so tenderly to their victims' correspondence. Lestrade opened his mouth and shut it again, and after a moment said that the forged letter was no doubt the work of someone else entirely, up at the house, and had nothing to do with the robbery, and that Holmes was tangling two separate threads. And he said all this at considerable length and with declining conviction, and Holmes let him say it, and ordered him another glass, and learned from him meanwhile every fact the Yard had gathered, which was the true purpose of the conversation. In the morning the fog had lifted a little, into a high white haze, and we walked out across the marsh to find Hawkins, against Lestrade's advice, and indeed without his knowledge. We found the old man in a leaning, half-flooded cottage of turf and tarred board, at the very place where the firm land gave out and the open marsh began, a place no one would live who had anywhere else on earth to go. He was a ruin of a man, gaunt and grey and palsied, with the broken veins of the lifelong drinker in his cheeks, and the wariness of a beaten dog in his eyes, and when he saw two strangers in good coats at his door, he took us at once, for the police come to take him, and his first and only instinct was to bolt out the back and into the marsh. But Holmes can gentle a frightened creature, man or beast, when he chooses to, with a low voice and an easy manner and a quick understanding of exactly what the creature fears, and within the half-hour the old man was seated at his own thin smoking fire, with a coin in his pocket and a flask of Holmes's brandy in his shaking hand, talking, low and fast and tumbling, as a man talks who has held a thing in for years and has only now, of a sudden, been given leave to put it down. I never touched the lawyer, sir. I swear it on my dead mother's grave. I never so much as saw him. I was on the Causeway Road that night. I'll not deny it, for it's the only road there is, and I'd been to the ferry house same as every night. But I was 3 good mile off by the time the gentleman met his end, for I was at the ferry house from before 9, and they threw me out of it at midnight, and there's a dozen sots, and the landlord himself will swear to every hour of it, for they all know old Hawkins and where he sits and how long he stays. I'd no cause to harm the man. I never knew the man. I'd no cause to harm a living soul. He swallowed, and the brandy shook in his hand. It's not the marsh I run from, sir, whatever the village says of me, and it's not the drink, though God knows the drink has me. It's that house. It's Caldmoor I run from. I came out here to the edge of the world to be as far from that house as a man can get, and still have ground under his feet. Why did you leave Caldmoor, Hawkins? Said Holmes, very quietly, leaning in. The plain truth of it, now. I think you have been wanting to tell some honest man the truth of it for 6 long years, and have never dared. You may dare now. Nothing you say in this room will be used to hang you, and a good deal of it, I think, may help to hang the man who deserves it. The old man was silent a long, long moment, staring into his fire. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a hoarse whisper, and he did not look up. It were about a year after the master shut himself away, he said. I was still in service then, the last of the old servants, the others all gone, or paid off. And Mr. Stephen, he were took with a fever, a bad one, a bed 3 days and out of his head with it, and there were no one in the house fit to carry the master his supper but me, for Mrs. Price, she'd long been forbid to go near the room, the same as all of us. So up I went with the tray. The first time in a year I'd been up that stair, and I knocked, and a voice come from inside, very low and far off, says, "Come," and I went in. And it were dark, sir, dark as dusk though it were the middle of the day, the curtains drawn most across, and the window wide behind them, and the cold coming off that open window, like the breath off a pond in winter, cold as a well, cold as January, and that in the warm of the year. And the master, he was sat in his great chair, with his back the half turned to me, toward the grey of the window, the way he always sat, and I set the tray down on the table at his side. And as I bent to it, he put out his hand to me, his left hand, slow, as if to take my arm and steady himself by it, and not thinking, I took it to help him. I took his hand in mine. He stopped. The fire hissed. Somewhere out on the marsh a bird called once and was still. And it were cold, sir, he whispered, not chilled, not cold the way a sick man's hand is cold, cold, cold as the grave is cold, cold all the way through, and stiff, stiff and hard and unbending, like a thing carved out of cold tallow, like a hand that has never in this world been warm and never will be. I dropped it, and I think I cried out, and I were down that stair and out of that house faster than ever I moved in my life, and I never went up again, not once. And a fortnight after, when Mr. Stephen were on his feet, he turned me off. No character, no reference. A few pounds in my hand, and a quiet word that I'd best hold my tongue about the master's condition, out of respect for the family, or it would go hard with me, for who'd take the word of a turned-off drunken servant against a gentleman? And I have held my tongue, sir, these 6 years. I have held it, till now. We left old Hawkins to his thin fire and his brandy, and walked back across the marsh toward the village in silence. The white haze had thickened again toward fog, and I found, glancing back, that I had no wish at all to look upon the dark, squared bulk of Caldmoor House, standing on its low rise against the pale sky. "Holmes," I said at last, "what did the man take hold of, up in that room?" Holmes walked a dozen paces before he answered. "Something," he said, "that the cold has kept, Watson, something that the cold was laid in to keep," and he would say no more, but only, after a while, "Come. There is a man in this village I wish to see before we sleep, and a set of books I wish to read, and I begin to think we may need both before this is done." The man he wished to see was Dr. Mortlake, the village physician, who lived in a square red house by the church, and who received us with the cautious civility of a man who has long had a question of his own, and has never known to whom he might safely put it. He was elderly, dry, precise, and when Holmes had explained our business, his dry precision cracked, and underneath it there came out something that had been pressing on the old doctor for years. "You ask me about Aldous Merivale," he said. "I will tell you, Mr. Holmes, what I have told no one, because no one has asked me plainly, and because it is not a thing a country doctor cares to say aloud about the first family of his parish. I attended Aldous Merivale for 20 years. I knew his body as I know my own. He had a weak and labouring heart, sir, an enlarged and failing heart, and I told him, the last time I examined him, which was some little while before his so-called collapse, that he might go at any hour, in his sleep, in his chair, that such a heart does not give long warning. I expected, that winter, to be called to Caldmoor to certify his death any day." "And were you called?" said Holmes. "I was not. That is the thing, sir. That is the very thing. I was never called again at all. Within a month or so of that examination came word that the master had suffered a collapse of the nerves and would see no physician, that he could not endure to be touched or examined, that Mr. Stephen would attend to all his wants. I wrote, I called twice, and was turned from the door with great courtesy. And from that day to this, 7 years, I have not been permitted to lay eyes upon a man whose heart I had pronounced ready to stop, and I have never been asked to attend him, and I have never, you understand me, Mr. Holmes, I have never been asked to sign anything. No man has died at Caldmoor House in 7 years, by any record I keep, or any certificate I have written, and yet that failing heart I held my stethoscope to has, we are told, gone on faithfully beating in the cold and the dark, year upon year, without a doctor, without a death, without an end. He looked at us steadily. I have wondered, sir. God forgive me, I have wondered, and held my peace, because wondering is not proof, and a man does not accuse the first family of his parish of he knows not what, on the strength of a heartbeat he expected to stop. You were right to wonder, said Holmes gravely, and you may have done a greater service by remembering it now than by speaking it then. One question more, Doctor, and it is an odd one. Aldous Merivale. With which hand did he write? The old doctor blinked. With his right, of course. A bold right hand, with a great flourish to the signature. He signed his own prescriptions back when he managed the estate's charities. The right, always the right. And he wore that old garnet signet upon the right little finger and pressed his seals with it. Why in heaven's name do you ask me a thing like that? Because, Doctor, said Holmes, rising, it is very often the smallest and oddest thing in a case that turns out to be the one that bears the whole weight of it. You have been of great help. Say nothing of our visit to anyone, I beg you, and least of all to anyone from the house, until you hear from me again. There is a kind of evidence in this world that does not lie, Watson used to say afterward, because it never occurs to anyone to make it lie. Holmes had a deep faith in such evidence, and went looking for it in places no novelist of crime would ever think to send him. While the village told its ghost stories, and Lestrade sat by the inn fire with his eye on a broken old drunkard, Holmes spent the better part of a long grey day going from shop to shop in Saxby-le-Marsh, to the butcher, the baker, the grocer, the fishmonger, the wine and spirit merchant, and asking, with the trustee's authority behind him, to see their books, their day books and ledgers and account tallies, 7 years of them. And in the evening he sat down with Mrs. Price's own household book, which the frightened housekeeper surrendered to him with shaking hands at Stephen's grudging word, and by the lamp at the inn he laid them all out across the table, the bills and the books and the tallies, and read the dull arithmetic of 7 years as another man might read a confession. 2 gentlemen live at Caldmoor House, Watson, he said, have lived there these 7 years, Aldous and Stephen, 2 grown men. One of them an invalid, I grant you, but invalids eat, invalids drink, an invalid above all who is fed by a devoted brother 3 times a day. Now attend to me and watch the figures, for the figures are about to say a thing aloud that no living mouth in this place has dared to whisper. Here is the butcher's account, month by month, year by year. Here the bakers, here the grocers, here the wine merchants, here the fishmongers. 7 full years of provision for the house of Caldmoor. And in every account, Watson, in every single one of them, from the very month the master closed his door down to this present week, the house has been provisioned for 1 man. 1 man's joint of meat, 1 man's loaf, 1 man's bottle, 1 man's measure of everything, never 2. Through 7 years, in 5 separate tradesmen's books kept by 5 separate honest men, who never compared a note among them, the house that holds 2 gentlemen has eaten, and drunk, and consumed, the provision of exactly 1. I stared at the long, honest columns of figures in the lamplight, and a cold that had nothing to do with the marsh began to climb my spine. But the trays, Holmes, I said, and my voice was not quite steady. We have seen them. Mrs. Price prepares a full tray for the master, 3 times a day. We watched it, carried up the stair with our own eyes. A tray is prepared, said Holmes, and carried up the stair, and carried down again. And I have looked beneath the cloth of the descending tray, Watson, twice now, on 2 separate occasions, when our host's back was turned upon the landing, and both times the food upon it was merely disturbed, pushed about the plate, a single forkful gone, perhaps no more. It is the performance of a meal eaten, Watson. It is not a meal eaten. Mrs. Price, poor soul, cooks each day for 2 men in perfect good faith, because she has been told there are 2 men, and has cooked for 2 men for 7 years, and never thought to wonder. The second portion goes up the stair, and comes down the stair, and is scraped into the pig pail in the scullery, and so the kitchen believes it feeds 2. But the tradesmen's books, you see, the books that no one ever thought of as evidence, because who in the wide world reads a butcher's ledger for the truth about a family? The books were never told the story. The kitchen was deceived. The books could not be. The house buys for one, Watson, because the house feeds one, because in the whole of Caldmoor there is, and has been, these 7 years, only one living man who eats. He sat back, and the lamplight made hollows of his eyes. "There is one man eating in that house, Watson," said Sherlock Holmes, very low, "and there are 2 men supposed to be living in it. I will leave the conclusion to you, for it is plain enough now, and I find I have no great appetite to say it first. I did not, that night, by my own choice, let myself follow the thought to its end, but I slept ill, and when at last I slept, I dreamed, and in the dream, a cold and stiff and carven hand reached out of the black of an open window toward me, and there was a green sleeve upon the arm of it, and over everything hung the smell of wet straw and melting ice." Holmes had not been idle in the matter of the law while I slept on my doubts. Through Lestrade, whom he had at last half persuaded, and through a telegraphed appeal to the surviving trustees in London, who were by now thoroughly alarmed, he had obtained by the second morning a paper. It was an order, thin and hasty and of doubtful weight, requiring that the living person of Aldous Merivale be confirmed, by sight, by a disinterested party, on the plain ground that a trustee charged with that very confirmation had died by violence directly upon attempting it. It was thin. In a calmer place, before a calmer man, it might have been brushed aside. But Caldmoor was not calm, and Stephen Merivale was a man living over a chasm, and in that fog of fear, the thin paper was enough to force the closed door at last. Stephen read the order through twice, standing in the cold hall, and when he looked up, his soft, sorrowful face had changed. It had gone quiet and flat and still, the face of a man who has walked a long way in the dark and felt, of a sudden, the ground begin to fall away beneath the next step. "You may see him," he said at last, and his voice was as flat as his face. "Briefly, very briefly, in the dark, for he cannot bear the light. You know it, you have been told it. You will not approach him, you will not touch him, you will not speak above a murmur, nor stay above a minute. And when, Mr. Holmes, you have seen with your own eyes that my brother lives, you will take your paper and your inspector, and you will leave this house, and you will leave this family, in what little peace is left to it. Those are my terms, and they are not to be argued." "I ask nothing more than to see him," said Holmes gently, "and I shall honour every word of it." And so we climbed the east stair at last, Stephen going before us with a single candle in his left hand, Holmes behind him, and I behind Holmes, and the stairs creaking one by one beneath us as we rose into the dark and the cold deepening with every step, until at the top of the flight we stood before a plain, heavy door, and Stephen set his hand upon the latch, and paused, and bowed his head a moment as if in prayer, and lifted it. The door swung in, and the cold came out of that room to meet us like a living thing, like a hand laid flat against the chest. The room beyond was dim as deep dusk, though it was full morning without, the heavy curtains drawn across to a hand's breadth, the great window beyond them standing wide open upon the grey marsh and the white sky, so that the chill of the whole fen seemed to pour in through it and stand in pools about the floor. And in a tall, high-backed chair, set with its back the half turned toward us, and its face toward that grey slit of light, there sat a figure in a green dressing gown. "Aldous," said Stephen, very softly, very gently, going to the side of the chair, but not before it. "Aldous, these gentlemen have come up from London, as I told you they might. They will not stay, they will not trouble you. Only say good morning to them, brother, and they will go, and I shall have the room to ourselves again, and all shall be as it was. Say good morning." For a long moment nothing moved in that cold, dim room but the curtains stirring at the open window. Then the figure's head turned, slowly, a few degrees only, toward the light and away from us, and a hand rose from the arm of the chair, slowly, the left hand, and made a small, vague gesture in the air, and fell again, and a voice came out of the chair. It was low and dry and strangely flat, a voice with no breath behind it, a voice that seemed to come from very far away down a cold passage. "Good," it said. "Good morning. Forgive me. I am not well. And after a pause, lower still, let me be. I beg you, let me be. I will tell you honestly what I saw, and you may make of it what you can, for at the time I made nothing of it but terror and a kind of pity, and I believed, God help my dull eyes, that I was looking upon a living invalid in the last extremity of nervous illness, a man so far sunk into the dark of his own mind that he could no longer bear the daylight or the company of men. That is what I saw. Holmes was not looking at the chair at all. From the moment the door opened, Holmes had not so much as glanced at the figure in the green gown. His eyes were going about that cold room, swift and silent, missing nothing. They went to the long, low, zinc-bound chest that stood against the wall in the corner, packed about with straw, with a shallow pan set beneath one end of it, into which something dripped, slowly, steadily, drop by drop in the silence. They went to the open window, and the curtains, and the deep, deliberate, established cold of the place. They went to the chair itself, set always, by long arrangement, with its back to the door, its face to the one grey source of dimmest light. And as they went, the colour drained slowly out of my friend's face, until it was the grey-white of the fog at the window. "Thank you," said Holmes very softly to the figure in the chair, and he bowed to it as he might have bowed to a living gentleman. "I am sorry beyond words to have disturbed your rest. We will go now, and leave you in your quiet." He turned, and we filed out, and Stephen drew the door shut behind us with infinite care, and we went down the cold stair in silence. On the landing below, out of Stephen's hearing while he lingered above to settle the latch, I caught Holmes by the sleeve. "Well," I whispered, half in relief and half in vexation, "there is your living man, Holmes." He turned his head, he raised his hand, he spoke to us, with his own mouth, in his own voice. "The whole dark business is a mare's nest after all, and the poor wretch is exactly what they say he is." Holmes turned to me upon that dark landing, and I have seldom in all our years seen his face so grave, nor his voice so low. "Watson," he said, "we have just been taken up and shown two men in that one room, and only one of them is living." He drew a long, slow breath of the cold air. "Come away from here. I have seen all that I came to see, and a good deal that I did not wish to see, and I do not care to breathe this air one moment longer than I must. We will go down to the village, and I will tell you the whole of it, for I am sure of it now, sure past any doubt, and we have a long night's work before us, and a sad one." That night I could not sleep at all. The thing Holmes had said upon the landing sat in me like a stone I had swallowed whole. Two men in that room, and only one of them living. I told myself, lying in the dark of my low room at the Heron, with the marsh wind worrying at the window, that he had meant it for a figure of speech, a manner of putting the man's deathly state, the half-death of his ruined mind. I did not believe myself for an instant. I had seen the colour leave Holmes's face. I had seen the long zinc chest, and the straw, and the slow drip into the pan. Toward midnight, standing at my window, unable to lie still, I saw a light out upon the marsh. It was not still, as a window's light is still. It moved, low and slow and steady, along the line of the causeway, the way a lantern moves when it is carried by a man who goes carefully and does not wish to be seen, who shows it only to his own feet and hoods it from the world. And in the faint grey wash of it, for a moment, as it passed a darker stretch, I thought I saw the pale, ghostly flutter of a long green gown. I was scarcely from my window before there came a soft knock at my door, and Holmes was there, fully dressed, his eyes bright in the candlelight. "You see it too," he said. "I have been watching this half-hour. Dress, quickly and quietly. And Watson, bring your revolver, and bring it to your hand, and not to your bag, for I think tonight the lie has decided to walk abroad, and a lie that walks is a frightened lie, and a frightened thing, when it is cornered between its ruin and the dark, is the most dangerous thing in this world. There is worse. Our client is not at her hotel." "Not at her hotel," I cried, struggling into my coat. "You sent her there yourself." I did, and she has left it. The boy from the Heron carried a note for her this afternoon, and I have only now wrung the truth of it out of him. She had a message, he says, in a hand she took for her Uncle Stephen's, begging her to come quietly to Caldmoor at nightfall, alone, to be reconciled at last to her Uncle Aldous before the end, and to tell no one. The fool of a brave girl has gone out onto that marsh alone, to a man who has already killed once to keep his secret, and who knows now, past any doubt, that the law is at his door. Come, we may already be too late, and if we are, I shall not forgive myself, and neither, I think, will you. We went out into the fog and the cold, and struck out along the causeway after that low-moving light, keeping ourselves to the soft, wet grass at the very edge of the raised path, where our feet made no sound on the marsh and we were below the line of any backward glance. The fog lay in banks and rivers, now thinning to show the stars, now closing again, until I could scarce see Holmes a yard before me, and through it the lantern went on ahead of us, and beyond the lantern, once, I caught the pale drift of the green gown, the figure moving with a strange, stiff, hurried gait, neither walking nor running, a thing in haste that has half forgotten how to hurry, and I saw that it carried a bundle clutched hard against its breast. "He is not making for the village," breathed Holmes at my ear, "nor for the station. He is making for the deep marsh, for the drowning pools beyond the old Staithe, where the mud goes down past the height of a man, where a thing may be put, and the marsh will keep it forever, and ask no questions. He means to drown the bundle, and I greatly fear, Watson, that the bundle is not all he means to drown tonight, for where, in God's name, is the girl?" We had our answer a moment later, and it turned my blood to water, for out of the fog ahead, from the direction of the black pools, there came a cry, a young woman's cry, sharp and short and quickly stifled, then silence. The figure with the lantern stopped dead upon the path, and stood a moment as if listening, then turned off the causeway entirely, down toward the water, toward the cry, the lantern swinging. "Now, Watson," said Holmes, "and pray God we are in time," and we abandoned all stealth and ran. We came down off the causeway into a nightmare country of black water and sucking mud and pale reed taller than a man, the fog wreathing through it, the lantern bobbing ahead, and below us, toward the brink of a wide black pool. And in the last of the lantern light, at the very edge of that pool, I saw Eleanor Merivale on her knees, in the mud where she had fallen or been thrown, one hand flung up before her face, and over her, the green gown hanging from his shoulders, his arm raised, and something heavy in his hand, stood Stephen Merivale. "Stephen Merivale," roared Holmes, and his voice cracked across the marsh like a whip. "It is finished. Put up your hand." The figure spun toward us, and the lantern light caught full upon the face above the green gown. And it was Stephen, of course, it was Stephen, his soft, sorrowful face wrenched now into something else entirely, a white mask of terror and grief, and a kind of madness, the face of a man who has run to the very end of a road and found the cliff. For an instant I thought he would strike the girl yet, and I had my revolver up, and Holmes was already springing forward, and the strength went out of the upraised arm, and the heavy thing, a marshman's iron-shod fowling club, fell from his fingers into the mud, and Stephen Merivale sank down where he stood, and put his hands over his face, and wept. I got Eleanor up out of the mud, shaken and bruised, and white but unhurt, and held her steady, while Holmes stooped to the bundle that Stephen had dropped at the pool's edge in the moment we rushed him. He drew open the wet sacking of it there in the lantern light, and from within it tumbled a man's green country coat, marked dark with marsh stains, a pair of muddied boots, a leather pocketbook stained darker still, and stiff with what had dried upon it, and last of all, a gentleman's gold watch, its case sprung open, its glass cracked clean across, its hands stopped forever at 20 minutes to midnight. "Harrington Vane's effects," said Holmes quietly, looking down at the broken man in the mud, and there was no triumph at all in his voice, only a great weariness. "Carried out at last, to be given to the deep, now that the marsh has grown too full of watchers for your comfort. You should have drowned them the first night, Mr. Merivale, with the rest of it. But you are not, by trade or by nature, a murderer, and a man who is not a murderer cannot quite bring himself to do the cold, clean murderer's thing, and so he keeps the proofs of his one terrible night hidden in a drawer, and tells himself he will be rid of them tomorrow, and tomorrow, until the law is on the stair. Come up out of the mud. It is bitter cold here, and you have a great deal to say that you have been wanting to say for 7 years, and I think it had far better be said now, in the warm, than here at the edge of this black water, with your hands so near to a third grief that you would never come back from. Come. We brought him back along the causeway between us, unresisting, all the fight and all the cunning gone out of him at once, a spent and hollow old man stumbling in his dead brother's gown. And we lit a great fire, the first in 7 years, in the cold parlour of Caldmoor House, and gathered about it, Holmes and I, and Eleanor wrapped in my coat, and Lestrade, sent for in haste from the inn, and arrived blustering, then very silent, and Mrs. Price, weeping without a sound in the doorway, and Stephen Merivale, in the midst of us, with his face to the new flames. And there, by the light of that long-denied fire, I watched Sherlock Holmes lay out the whole truth of Caldmoor, bone by bone, as a man lays out upon a table the bones of a thing long buried, and lifts them at last into the light. The whole difficulty of this case, Holmes began, the thing that made it seem an impossibility, was that every one of us, myself included for the first hour, was asking the wrong question. We all asked, how could a man who never leaves his room be seen abroad upon the marsh? We turned it this way and that, and could find no answer that was not either a miracle or a ghost. We should have asked a different question altogether. We should have asked, what manner of man is it who never leaves his room? And the answer, when at last I let myself look at it, was the simplest and the most dreadful in the world. The man who never left that room had not left it because he could not leave it, because he was dead, because Aldous Merivale has been dead these 7 years and has lain in that one cold room the whole of that time and never once left it, exactly as the whole valley has always said. Eleanor made a small sound and pressed her hand to her mouth. Lestrade came half out of his chair, and Stephen Merivale, staring into the fire, slowly bowed his head and did not deny it. He died, Holmes went on, more gently now, as Dr. Mortlake long ago foretold that he would, of that failing heart, suddenly, on an ordinary morning 7 years past. Is that not so, Mr. Merivale? On a morning in March, said Stephen, and his voice was the dead flat voice we had heard come out of the chair upstairs. Only now we knew whose voice it truly was. He rose and dressed and stood at his window looking out at the marsh as he liked to do, and he gave a little sound, a little gasp, no more, and put his hand to his breast and went down. He was gone before I had crossed the room to him, gone before I could reach the bell. And I stood over him, gentlemen, and I understood the whole of my ruin in one breath. The day his heart stopped, the income stopped, the house passed to her, the allowance ended. I would be put out of the only home I had ever known, at 60 years of age, with a few pounds, and no place in a world I had not so much as walked in for 30 years, to make my own way or to starve. And the bell rope was in my hand, and I did not pull it. God forgive me. I did not pull the bell. Instead, said Holmes, taking up the thread softly, you began, that very hour, to keep him, and the cruelest part of all is that you did not need to invent the means. Your brother's own illness had already given you the perfect blind. He had always, in his nervous affliction, demanded the cold, the open window, the unlit grate, and so a cold and fireless room, which would have been a strange and remarkable thing in any other house, was at Caldmoor merely the master's well-known whim of 7 years' standing. You had only to deepen what was already there. You kept the window wide. You let no fire ever be lit. You bound that chest with zinc and packed it with straw, and you brought in ice, cartloads of it, year upon year, in summer and winter alike, and you told the household it was for the dairy and for the master's comfort in close weather, and the household believed you, because why in the world would it not? And so you kept your brother, as this marsh keeps everything that falls into it, cold and dark and changeless, year upon year. That is why no fire has burned in this house in 7 years. That is why the ice cart calls in October, not for the comfort of a living man's nerves, for the preservation of a dead man's flesh. The cold images came back to me then with a terrible new meaning: the swept black grate, the cart in the yard, the dripping zinc chest in the corner of that dim room, the open window pouring its chill across the floor. Eleanor was weeping quietly. Mrs. Price had sunk down upon a chair by the door with her apron to her face. "And you became him," Holmes said. "That was the whole of the rest of it, and it was a labor I can scarcely imagine, sustained alone for 7 years. You wrote his quarterly letters in your own left hand, fluently, naturally, year upon year, and they passed, because no trustee ever set them side by side with the bold right-handed letters of the living Aldous, for they had no reason in the world to suspect there was anything to compare. You spoke his wishes to the household, and to the lawyers, and to your own niece through a closed door, until no one in this house had heard the master's own voice in so long that they had forgotten what it sounded like, and would not have known a false note if you struck one. And on the rare occasions when an audience could not be refused, you yourself became the figure in the chair. You put on his green gown, and drew the curtains close, and set the chair with its back to what little light there was, and sat in it, and gave your visitor a few cold, flat words across your shoulder, your face always turned away, the room always too dark and too cold for any man to wish to linger in it. You played the living brother in the daylight, and guarded the dead one in the dark, and you did it utterly alone, for the one unbreakable rule of the whole long deception was that no second living soul might ever be allowed past that door. That is why poor Hawkins was turned off the very fortnight he chanced to take a dead man's hand. That is why your own niece was kept 7 years upon the wrong side of the wood. I understood it all now, every thread of it pulled tight. The note in the left hand, the cold, stiff, carven hand that Hawkins had taken in the dark. The figure we ourselves had been shown that morning, that had raised its left hand and spoken in a dead, flat voice with its face turned away, and that had been, the whole time, not the dead man in his chair at all, but the living brother performing him, while the true Aldous lay hidden in the cold not 6 feet off, in the zinc chest beneath the window. "And the books," Holmes said, almost with tenderness, "the dull, honest, unanswerable books. Mrs. Price here has cooked for 2 men, faithfully, 3 meals a day, for 7 years, and has never once doubted there were 2 men to cook for, but only 1 man ever ate. The full tray went up the stair, and the all but untouched tray came down it, and the second portion was scraped away into the pail to keep the kitchen's faith, and so the kitchen believed it fed 2. The tradesmen do not cook performances. They sell what is bought, and they write down what is sold, and what they wrote down, every one of them, for 7 unbroken years, was the provision of 1 single man, a house that holds 2 gentlemen, buying bread and meat and wine for 1. That, Inspector, is the one thing in all this business that no ghost story could ever explain, and that no passing robber would ever trouble to arrange. A house that has eaten for 1, and grieved for none, since the spring of 7 years ago." "For 7 years," Holmes said, and his voice hardened now, "the lie held, because no living man insisted on looking behind it. Then the law, in its slow, blind way, changed its mind. Old Tolliver died, and Harrington Vane took his chair at the trustees' table, and Vane was a new man and a careful one, and Vane would not certify a life he had not seen breathe. 3 times you put him off. The 4th time you could put him off no longer, for he had told you to your face, and told your niece, that he would bring the police, and a doctor, and an order of the court, and have that room opened by main force, if he were refused again. And so you did the one thing left to you. You granted him his audience. You sat in the chair, in the gown, in the dark and the cold, with your face turned away, and you gave Harrington Vane the few flat words across your shoulder, and prayed that they would serve as they had always served before." "But they did not serve," said Holmes, "because Vane was sharper than the others, and because something in that room was wrong, and a good lawyer feels a wrongness in the air, the way an old sailor feels a change of weather, long before he can name it. Perhaps it was only the unnatural cold of a sick man's chamber. Perhaps the figure failed some small test he set it, some matter of the trust that only the true Aldous could have answered, and answered wrongly, or did not answer at all. Or perhaps, Mr. Merivale, it was the simplest thing of all. Perhaps it was that the master in the chair raised his left hand, and Vane, who had in his own office in London a drawer full of the genuine letters of Aldous Merivale, every one of them penned in that bold right hand and sealed with a garnet signet pressed by the right, looked at the left hand that rose from the arm of that chair and felt the whole world tilt under him, without yet being able to say why. He left, as you say, with a courteous word, seeming satisfied. But he was not satisfied. He had felt the wrongness, and he was a man who acted upon what he felt, and you saw it in his face as he went out, and you knew, with absolute certainty, that he would be back upon your stair within the week, with the doctor and the magistrate, and the end of everything. So you followed him out onto the marsh that night, Holmes said quietly. You put on the green gown still, I think, scarcely knowing any longer where your brother ended, and you began, and you went after him, along the dark causeway, and on the loneliest stretch of it, you struck him down from behind. Then you did the things a frightened man does, to make a murder look like a meaner crime. You took his watch and his pocketbook, to dress it as a robbery for the coroner. And you came home, and you sat down, and in the cold, dead, small hours, you wrote out one last letter in the dead man's left hand, dated that very day, full of warm satisfaction at how pleasantly the interview had gone, and at first light you carried it down to the village and posted it to London, so that the trustee's own records should show Aldous Merivale alive and content and grateful on the very morning his last accuser lay dead on the marsh. And 3 honest souls, going early about their business through the fog, saw the green gown moving upon the causeway, and knew it for the master's, and swore for ever after that the master himself had walked, and could not be shaken from it, because they had seen, with their own eyes, exactly and precisely what they said they had seen. It was no phantom upon the marsh, said Holmes, and it was no walking dead man. It was the living brother going abroad in the dead one's skin, the man who never left the room, never left it, and never could, for he was 7 years in his grave in all but name. And the man the whole world took for him had never, in all that time, truly been the man in that room at all, but only its keeper and its forger, and at the last, to hold the secret it held, its murderer. That, gentlemen, is the whole of the matter of Caldmoor House. Stephen Merivale had not lifted his head through any of it. When at last he spoke, it was not to any of us, but to the fire. I meant it to be for a month, he said. I swear before God that is the truth. Only a month. A little time to find a place, to think how a man begins his whole life over again at 60, to gather what small courage I had. I told myself I would register his death the moment I had somewhere to go, that I was only borrowing the time, that no one was harmed by it. But the month went, and the quarter day came round, and the letter fell due, and I sat down and I wrote it, because to fail to write it was to confess everything, and the moment I had written that first false letter, I could never unwrite it, for it was a crime, and the next letter must cover the first, and the next the second, and the quarter became a year, and the year became 7, and my brother lay in the cold, and I sat in his chair, and I wore his gown, and there were whole days together, gentlemen, whole days, when I could not have told you with any certainty which of the 2 of us was the living man and which the dead. I never hated him, he said. The village will say I did, that I killed him for the money and kept him for the money, and the money is true enough, God knows, but the hate is not. I kept him because I could not let him go, and I could not let him go because the very hour I let him go, I myself ended. I ceased. There was no more Stephen in the world, only a poor turned-off old man with nowhere on the earth to lay his head. And so I held us both there in the cold, the 2 of us, brother and brother, the dead and the living, year upon year. Then that careful man came with his careful eyes, and I saw 7 years of cold come down all at once to a single walk upon the marsh and a single blow in the dark, and I struck it, and I have been falling ever since. His voice broke at last. I have done a thing for which there is no cold deep enough anywhere in this world to keep me. Holmes looked down at him for a long moment, and there was in his grey face neither the smallest triumph nor the smallest contempt, but something I had very rarely seen there in all our years, a thing I can only call pity, held hard under guard. "You are a murderer, Mr. Merivale," he said at last, quietly. "For Harrington Vane, and for Harrington Vane alone, you will answer with your life, and you will answer rightly. For he was an honest man, doing his honest duty, and you broke his head in the dark to keep a secret. But the 7 years that went before that night were not murder. I do not have a proper name for what they were. They were a grief that would not lie down and be buried, and that turned, at the very last, having nowhere else to go, into blood." He inclined his head the smallest fraction toward the broken man at the fire. "And I am sorry, for whatever it is worth to you now, for the man you must have been, on that March morning, in the moment before the bell rope was in your hand, and you did not pull it." Lestrade rose then, and did his duty, and there was the small, cold, practical sound of the law closing at last over a pair of wrists, and Stephen Merivale went out of the warm parlour and into the night and into the hands of the courts without one word more, walking steadily, an old man with all his secrets out of him at last, and nothing left inside but the ash of them. They opened the cold room to the daylight on the morning after, drew back the curtains that had been 7 years half closed, and threw up the sashes, and let the thin October sun, such as it was, fall full into a chamber that had not known an honest morning since before the girl downstairs had grown to be a woman. And there, in the long zinc-bound chest beneath the window, packed about in fresh straw and in ice, that the dead man's own brother had renewed faithfully for 7 years, they found Aldous Merivale, kept by the cold very nearly as he had been on the March morning his heart had stopped him at that same window, waiting, all that long while, in the one room he had truly never left. He was buried that week in the small marsh churchyard by the grey church, properly at last, with a service read over him, and his own name, and his 2 dates cut true and deep into a new white stone, the second of those dates some 7 years later than the truth of it, so that any stranger reading it in years to come would never guess the strange long winter that lay between the day he died and the day they finally let him rest. Eleanor stood alone at the head of the grave and wept, and her weeping, I understood, was a strange double grief. For an uncle she had believed herself to have lost only that same week, and who had in plain fact been taken from her 7 years before, while she stood begging at a closed door to a man already long past hearing her. The whole great fortune came to her, of course, as her grandfather's hard will had always meant it should, and with it came the bitter knowledge that it had been hers in law and in right for 7 full years, and that through all those years a dead man had been kept like a winter store in a cold room, and a living one had worn his skin and signed his name, and at the last a good and honest stranger had been struck down on a dark causeway, all of it, every cold and dreadful part of it, to keep her from the simple knowledge of what was already hers. She did not keep Caldmoor. She could not, she told us, ever again pass a night beneath that roof, but she sought out old Hawkins herself, before she left the marsh for good, and gave into his palsied hands the deed of a snug cottage upon good dry land far from the water, and a pension to keep him warm and fed, and in such peace, as was left to him for the rest of his days, for the sake of the cold hand he had once taken in the dark, and the terrible truth he had carried, alone and disbelieved, for 6 long years. And Caldmoor House itself, where no fire had been suffered to burn in 7 years, was opened up at last from cellar to attic, every window of it thrown wide to the marsh air, every grate swept and laid and lit, until the whole great cold pile stood blazing and steaming in the autumn dusk, like a ship come back from the ice, and the chill that had been kept and tended and renewed within its walls for 7 deliberate years poured up and out of it and away across the dark marsh and was gone. We came back to London in the rain 2 days later, and I confess that I was glad of the rain, and glad of the noise of the cabs and the crowds and the close, warm, living press of the city, after the great, cold, ringing silence of that house upon the fen. "You knew," I said to him, when we were at last settled again before our own honest fire in Baker Street, with the lamps lit and the rain on the glass and the kettle singing, "you knew it, or near enough, from almost the moment we crossed the threshold, the empty grate. You stood and stared at that swept cold fireplace as though it had spoken to you aloud." "I suspected from the cold," said Holmes, leaning back with his eyes half closed and the firelight warm upon his face. "It was the cold that first turned the key. A house, Watson, keeps its fires lit for the living, and a man may go cold in his parlour to spare his coal. But a house that keeps one room above all the others, deliberately and perpetually colder than the marsh outside its window, year upon year, that withholds warmth from the very chamber of its sick and aging master, is a house that is keeping that room cold for a reason that has nothing to do with the comfort of anyone alive. There is only one thing a man takes such pains to keep cold, Watson." From that one cold fact, the rest followed, if one had only the stomach to follow it. The cartloads of ice, the note penned in the wrong hand by a left-handed man, the poor drunken servant, and the cold carven thing he had touched in the dark and run from, the doctor who had foretold a death he was never afterward allowed to certify, and the dull, honest tradesman's books that fed one mouth for 7 years and called it 2. Each of them, taken alone, was nothing at all, a curiosity, a coincidence, a thing easily explained away. But taken together, they could mean one thing only, and that one thing was so dreadful that not one soul in all that valley had ever once allowed themselves to set the little facts side by side and read what they spelled. Men will believe in a phantom on the marsh, Watson, far sooner than they will let themselves believe in a brother who could not bear to bury his brother, and so kept him in the ice, and wore his face, and at the last killed for him. "It is a terrible story," I said. "It is a human one," said Holmes, gazing into the coals, "which, my dear Watson, you will find by the end, is very often the same thing said twice. Remember it the next time you are tempted to call a thing impossible because it cannot be. The master of Caldmoor never once left his room in 7 years. Every soul in that grey valley believed it, and every single soul was entirely right. He never left it. He simply was not, by the time you and I came up the stair to him, the man they all imagined was keeping so faithfully to it." He closed his eyes, and the rain ran down the black glass, and the fire settled in the grate. "The very hardest lies to see through, Watson, are not the clever ones, nor the bold ones. They are the ones that are, from first to last, entirely and exactly true." And outside our window the London rain came softly down, and the lamps along Baker Street wore their old, familiar halos of wet gold, and the warmth of our own fire stood up bravely against the dark and the wet. And somewhere far off, across the cold and silent fens of Essex, an old grey house stood with all its windows open to the night at last, letting out, into the dark over the marsh, the last of 7 long years of winter. If you have stayed with this story all the way to its quiet end, then you are exactly the kind of listener I make these for, the kind who is willing to sit a while in the fog and to watch the small things, the empty grate and the cart in the yard, and to let a mystery take all the time it needs to come clear. There is another case waiting in the dark, stranger even than this one, a candle that would not burn, in a sealed room that everyone swore was empty, in a house where the dead were said to walk the upper floor. It is on the screen now. Stay a while longer here by the fire with me. Let me tell you that one too.